So I'm excited to introduce our next speaker and content for today, Annie Rosencrans. She's going to talk a little bit about how do we support and scale on a global scale and develop culture and networks and different connections, stuff like that. So Annie, thank you so much for being here with us. I welcome you to the stage. Let's give her a round of applause.
Can you all hear me without the mic? Is this better? Yes. Okay. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. As Zach mentioned, I'm Annie Rosencrans. I lead the People and Culture team for the Americas at HiBob. So I'm really excited to share with you a little bit about what I've learned through my year and a half here. So let me take a step back before I jump into the content. First, I want to talk about all the changes we've experienced over the last 4 years. It's been a very tumultuous time. I think you can all agree, particularly for us as HR leaders. When we started off, or back in 2019, pre-pandemic, we were probably floating along the bottom here of that roller coaster, not knowing what was about to hit us. And then all of these things happened. This is not exhaustive. We've had to deal with a lot through the last 4 years. Obviously, starting with the pandemic, going to remote work, and trying to figure out vaccine policies, social distancing policies, how do we keep up with all the regulations, how do we bring people back to work, and then, of course, the Great Resignation. Any Great Resignation participants here in the room? Anyone who resigned from their jobs? I did. Yeah, okay, that statistically makes sense. All right. And then, of course, a lot of companies, HiBob included, did a lot of hiring during that time. So 2021, our headcount expanded dramatically. And then, of course, the Ukraine war, obviously macroeconomic issues, that impacted all of us quite a bit. That impacted things like inflation rates, interest rates, and of course, many of us have felt the impacts of that on the economy and our own businesses. I'm sure some of you may have had some downsizing, etc. Needless to say, we've been through a lot, and what I want to talk to you about today is how to take the challenges that will inevitably continue to come. A lot of change is inevitable, of course, but we know from the last 4 years, it's going to continue at a pretty rapid pace. So what I want to talk about is how we take that and set up our companies for success so that we come out the other side stronger, better, happier, more engaged companies and people. So a little backstory. I'm going to talk about HiBob. And I'm going to talk about it from before I got there. So I joined in October of 2021. We have one representative here from HiBob who, you can correct me if I get any of the history wrong, Adam. But HiBob was founded in 2015 by 2 Israeli co-founders, and they had a dream of building a platform that was global, people first, and one that would really change the way that we all work. So they started the company in Tel Aviv. That's where the majority of our executive team started out. And then they quickly expanded into London, where Adam is originally from. You'll hear his accent with you. And then over the course of several years after that, they opened up in Amsterdam, and then later in New York in 2018. Fast forward to 2021, January of 2021, again, before I joined HiBob, we were in 4 offices around the world. We had almost 400 employees, a very lean HR team of 7, and an estimated 25 nationalities represented across the company. So pretty global, but we weren't aware of just how global we were about to become. So a year later, a little over that, we are actually 2 years later, I should say, we're now in 7 countries. So we expanded into Sydney, Australia. We acquired a company in Portugal. We are also now in Berlin. So we are a very global company. And I'm giving you this context so that when I talk to you about some of the solutions, I'm going to use a few case studies from this experience. But in terms of representation, we have a COO in London. We now have our CRO and CMO in New York City. So our executive team is spread out. We also have all of our employees outside of Tel Aviv are about 50% remote. So we're dealing with a mix of office employees and remote employees across 50-plus nationalities. So we have to think about language, culture, time zones, a lot of challenges that we've had to deal with. So in reflecting on the experience that I've had at HiBob, as well as prior companies, and also thinking about great companies out there in the world, I reflected on what are the things that make these companies successful through all the change that we've experienced. And there are three things I came up with. The first is they've mastered the fundamentals. The simple things, they get really right. And I'll talk to you about what that looks like. They've also codified their culture. They have a really clear sense of who their people are and what good looks like in their culture. And the third is that they've remained agile. Obviously, with such a changing environment, we need to make sure we change with the environment around us and keep up with the times. So, first principle, master fundamentals. So there are a couple things I think about as, for HR, there's a lot of admin. There's a lot of stuff that we need to do to keep the ship afloat, to keep the business running. And getting those things right is so important, and what it really does is it allows us to break out of that and focus on what we really care about. As HR professionals, I know I didn't get into the field because I love doing payroll or paperwork. I care about the people. So if you master the fundamentals and get the simple things right, you can then focus your attention on what really matters. So the first thing, grounding all of your business decisions in a clear mission and vision. And repeating it constantly. Making sure that all of your employees understand exactly what your purpose is. And ensuring that your goals, your actions, everything that you do is in support of that mission and vision. And in thinking about companies that do this really well, the first one that comes to mind is Google. Anyone know Google's mission? Okay. Or guess? Any guesses?
Do no harm.
Do no harm. I don't. Isn't it the Hippocratic Oath? Thank you. So Google's mission is to share the world's information, or to, now I'm forgetting it. Something around storing the world's information and making it accessible in one click. Everything that they do, they've been around for probably 20 years now. They're a huge organization. They have a million different sub-departments and product lines. But at the end of the day, everything that they do is about storing the world's information. And that is so critical to ensuring that everyone at the company ultimately is rowing in the same direction. That's my nice image here. So in addition to having a clearly articulated mission and vision, the next thing is having goals that align to it. And this is all probably for HR people, this probably sounds really obvious, right? But a lot of companies aren't doing it. A lot of companies aren't, you may have departmental goals, but are they published clearly across the organization? Are they something that if someone in sales can look at the marketing team or the tech team and know exactly what they're seeking to do? Having these publicized, having them also be agile, we'll talk about agility in a bit, but that is essential to an organization that's going to succeed long term. The second thing, and this is really important, but it's definitely fundamental, particularly for leaders and HR leaders specifically, is communicating with intention. How do you share information? Doing it in a way that is purposeful. So we as HR people, we're constantly having to communicate information that we want our people to know about. Whether it's your W-2s are coming out or something more fun or strategic, we need people to read the things that we're putting out to the world. And similarly, our CEOs, executives, they need to share information about what's going on in the organization. But if they're not doing it in a way that's going to resonate, and particularly for global organizations, in a way that takes into account cultural differences, languages, time zones, it's not going to stick. It's not going to stick with your people. And one of the things that I came to realize in the last couple of years is the best HR people are actually really amazing marketers too. It's not just putting together an email and saying, read this thing. We need to think about how we're putting it out there. Is it, what tools we're using, what language we're using, if we're branding it. All these things are critical to making sure that people are going to listen. So this is something that I actually love about the job. You get to be really creative, but we also need to make sure we're intentional about it and partner with your marketing teams. If this is not something that comes naturally to you, make sure you have a really strong connection with your marketing team so that you can take your initiatives and make them a little more creative so that people listen. And then the third thing, Work smarter, not harder. Leverage tools that will make your lives easier. We don't get into this business because we like the admin work. We want to help the people. We want to be strategic. Let's use tools that will make our lives better and also make the lives of our employees better. I'm going to try not to do a plug for Bob too blatantly here, but selecting tools, including HR tools, that streamline the experience, that are globally minded. They're a global organization. I assume most of you in this room are. Having tools that take into account, again, languages, currencies, date formats, things that will make all of your employees feel like the tools they're using are meant for them is really important. Also having tools, an example is onboarding. Your onboarding platform should be able to customize or configure to meet the needs of your global organization. So if you're onboarding people in Europe, it may look a little bit different than onboarding people in Asia or in the US. So having tools that will automate that, so you're not spending time administratively trying to figure out how to do it. You can build that into your system and have, again, more of a hands-off, streamlined experience. Okay, that's the first principle, master your fundamentals. Now that you've got that down, then we talk about culture a little bit. So what's incredibly challenging for all of us that work with global organizations is we have people with a lot of different perspectives, a lot of different cultures. Identifying a cohesive company culture is really, really hard. It was something that was hard for HiBob as well, in many ways. When I joined in October of 2021, we didn't have a clearly defined set of values. We had what our CEO called our DNA. And in my first company, All Hands, that I joined, it was actually my first day on the job, there was a slide in our All Hands meeting that just said our DNA, and it was just a bunch of bullet points with things that our CEO threw together. But the point was that he had a sense of what it meant to be a bobber. He was really clear on that. But we didn't have a shared language around what that looked like. So mid-last year, we decided, okay, it's time to codify our values and what language we use to define what it means to be a bobber here. And we put together what we called our values squad. And their mission was not to create values, it was to uncover our values. Uncover what was already there and put a shared language around it. So they did a pretty big research project. They got together, I think it's 10 people from different sites, different cultures, different departments, and they investigated. They hosted focus groups, one-on-one interviews. They sat down with each executive to understand what each senior level person thought made up a bobber. They looked at employee survey results. We looked at our code of conduct, our handbook. We really investigated. And through all that research, put together a rough draft. What are the values that we thought sort of connected all the dots on that research? We drafted, redrafted, came up with some wording. I went to the marketing team and said, how can we tweak this to be more interesting language? And we came up with these 6 values. Now, I'm not going to read all of them here. You can read them on your own, but the point was, came up with 6 that were not typical. Hopefully you can see all. I'll send this out after if you want. And in addition to the headlines, we wanted to make sure the headlines were clear, they were interesting, they were unique to Bob. But we also wanted to make sure that they were relatable, that they made sense in our actual day-to-day. So beyond the headlines, we also went through an exercise where we identified what are the behaviors that embody or that represent some of these values. So we put maybe a list of 10 different examples of what behaviors matched up with each of these values, so that there's no one definition of what it means to bring people this week, right? But maybe there are a couple of examples that can represent it, so that when someone sits down to do their performance review, they can connect something that they did to one of their values. And then, of course, we partnered with our marketing team, put some imagery against it, because we are branders, we are marketers, not just HR professionals. We wanted to make sure there was something pretty and relatable and branded against our values. And then came time to really embed it into the business. So we launched these values at our company all hands meeting. We had our members of our values squad stand up and talk about the behaviors that they were connected to, examples of things that they've seen or done that connected them to the values. Then we started to integrate it into our everyday language. We used our values in recognition. We used a kudos feature within Bob to shout out great performance, and a lot of people we started to see would highlight the value that an employee lived or embodied in the course of their day-to-day work. So really bringing it into our day-to-day culture. And then next, we thought about what are the experiences in the employee journey, or the critical points in the employee journey where we can integrate our values. So we started the recruiting process. We thought about, when we interview candidates, what are some of the questions we can ask that will get at whether or not these are values that these people live and embody every day. So it started with interviewing, then we thought about, okay, the performance review process, we do this twice a year. This is a great opportunity to embed our values in that. So we integrated a question on that in the last cycle. We'll probably go a layer deeper on the next cycle at the end of the year. But point is, people started to, again, get really comfortable with using the values in their everyday language. And the big one, and the one that we are still in process of embedding, is how do we leverage our values when it comes to promotion, rewards, even letting people go? That it's a really hard one, I know for all of us, but if someone's great at their job, at the fundamentals of their job, but say they are not a good team player, or they make everyone around them worse at their job, maybe that's not someone that we want to have here. And that's where the values come in really. They are much more helpful. We can't look to specific performance outcomes, but we can look to our values. Okay, so that's a little sneak peek into codifying your values and your culture. The third one is to stay agile. As I mentioned, as you all know, the world around us is changing faster than we can imagine. We need to make sure that even if the fundamentals are there, the culture is there, if we don't stay agile, we're not going to keep up. So one example, one of the things that HiBob experienced is we started noticing that the way we were doing certain things a year ago or 2 years ago wasn't working with the way our business is running today. We started to identify certain friction points in our everyday work. And one of those friction points was the all-hands meeting. I think this will resonate with my Bob team members. So early days of Bob, and those who joined before me can probably attest to the fact that the all-hands meeting was initially pretty casual. At the time, it was, at the company's founding, they were in Tel Aviv, they were in London, 2-hour time gap, a relatively small organization, so our CEO every month would get up and he'd share a little update on the business. He'd put together his own slides, marketing had nothing to do with it, he'd just do what he wanted. And it kind of worked. It felt homey, it felt connected, it did its job. But then we expanded into a couple more countries, time zones where it became a little more challenging. We were a more legitimate company. We were 400 employees all of a sudden, and we need to be a bit more finessed on how we thought about internal communications. So we got our marketing team involved, our CPO got involved. She started to make sure that the content was well thought out, that there was a little bit more strategy behind it. And then we introduced a new program we called our guest host program, our all-hands host program, where we invited employees at various levels of the organization to self-nominate to be the host of the all-hands meeting. And that was a way to, one, introduce people from across the organization who may not know each other to people. It was also a great chance for employees to present their leadership and their speaking skills. So it was served multiple purposes. And it was really successful. People were into it. It made the experience more human, more fun, and that was great. But what we realized was that there was an underlying issue here, and that was time zones. These are all of the main sites that were present at HiBob. And as you can see, those in California and Australia really didn't have a favorable situation. So the Californians would get up at 4 or 5 a.m. for the monthly global all-hands meeting, I'm sure begrudgingly. And then the Australians, I don't think they showed up. And we realized, we knew this, it was pretty obvious, but we started hearing a lot of grumblings. Survey results were reflecting the Australian team was feeling a little cut out. the West Coast US people were feeling a little bit excluded, not thought about. So we realized it's time to make a little shift here. So we did what we internally on the HR team called, we went global, local, and thought about how can we shift our approach so that we're thinking about the global presence, we're thinking about how we can engage and share a common message to the global audience, but also account for local differences, including time zones. So starting this year, we decided, okay, we're not going to do monthly all hands. It's too much noise. There's too many meetings, frankly, and they weren't adding the value that they used to. So we now have a global all hands that's every quarter, but by global we mean everyone but Australia, unfortunately. However, we also made an arrangement with Australia to say every quarter our CEO or another member of the executive team will do the meeting at 4 a.m. or whatever time it is that makes sense for Australia, so that they get the exposure to the global message that everyone else is getting. So someone's making a sacrifice to ensure that Australia is really feeling included. And then we rolled out regional meetings. So every quarter now, we're doing site-level all-hands meetings where we can share information that's a bit more relevant to the regional site. So in this, we came up with a global approach. And this concept of global is not just exclusive to all-hands meetings or meetings in general. It applies across things like employee engagement. So we decided from an employee engagement standpoint this year that we wanted to have a few global initiatives that we did across the world, but we also wanted to make sure that they were locally relevant. So we gave flexibility, we offered flexibility to the people executing on the ground to make some tweaks or adjust the approach to make sense for the site that they're operating in. So global, again, is not exclusive to this specific example. It's really just a microcosm of the larger message of continue to be agile. Think about, again, your friction points. What are the things that you were doing a year ago that no longer are working, and be ready to pivot as you need to. And if we do all these things right, the three fundamentals, which I'll show again in a second, I strongly believe that we all will be better set up to endure the challenges ahead and as Zach said, thrive in the future. So again, focus on mastering the fundamentals, codifying your culture, and really stay agile.